It all began in the golden haze of childhood, in the lively halls of a primary school where two hearts first met. Jennet, with her infectious smile and a book always in hand, was the quiet, studious type, her world a collection of words, stories, and numbers that made sense to no one but her. Chris, on the other hand, was the mischievous boy with a smile that could melt anyone's resolve. His charm was effortless, his wit sharp, and his world was filled with laughter, games, and moments of carefree rebellion. Yet, despite their differences, they were drawn together as if their souls had always known each other. Their bond was undeniable, almost immediate, like an invisible thread that connected them in ways words never could. They became inseparable, a pair of opposites that somehow made perfect sense. In every classroom, in every corner of the playground, they were together, laughing, whispering secrets, sharing dreams. There was an unspoken promise between them. No matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to one another. Jennet helped Chris with his homework, often hiding her amusement behind a quiet smile as she patiently guided him through the hardest lessons. In return, Chris made her laugh in ways no one else could, his humor infectious, his antics always leaving her with a sense of joy that lingered long after the school bell rang. Their days were simple, but filled with a quiet magic, a joy that came from knowing someone understood them in a way no one else did. But as they stood on the cusp of a new chapter, everything began to shift. Secondary school came, and the world, once small and simple, suddenly grew larger, more complex. Jennet was sent to an all-girls school, her life suddenly filled with new faces, new pressures, and the weight of expectations that seemed to pull her in every direction. Chris, too, found himself following the boys in his class to an all-boys school, where his charm and bravado made him popular, but the essence of who he was seemed to slip further and further away from the boy she had once known. The space between them grew, and what had once been an easy, natural connection began to feel strained, forced. Messages became less frequent, their calls fewer, until one day, the silence became too loud to ignore. The easy rhythm of their friendship, a bond formed in the innocent days of youth, was now lost in the tide of growing up, of finding their own paths, of becoming someone they weren't quite sure of yet. In the blink of an eye, childhood friends became distant memories, like faded photographs tucked away in the corners of their minds. And though they both tried to move on, to fill the gaps left by their separation, there was always a quiet ache in their hearts, an ache for something that had been lost, something that had once been so simple and pure, before life complicated everything. Lost years in those years apart, Chris slowly became a stranger to the boy he used to be. At first, it started with small rebellions, skipping classes, talking back to teachers, sneaking out with friends who admired his boldness. Being the son of a wealthy and respected man gave him a sense of invincibility. Rules felt optional. Discipline felt like oppression. And the attention he got from being the rich, stubborn boy fed his ego. But small rebellions turned into serious consequences. His grades dropped. Warnings became suspensions. Suspensions became expulsion. The day he was sent home for good, his father didn't shout. He didn't beat him. He didn't even argue. He simply looked at him with disappointment, so heavy it felt like a physical weight on Chris' chest. That silence hurt more than punishment. For months, Chris drifted. His old friends slowly disappeared when his money stopped flowing. The same boys who encouraged recklessness were nowhere to be found when trouble came. He began to see the truth. He had been admired, not respected. One night, after returning home from a pointless outing, he overheard his father speaking to a family friend. "I have failed him," his father said quietly. "All the opportunities wasted." Those words pierced him. For the first time, Chris felt the full weight of his choices. Not anger, not pride.
Shame.
The turning point came unexpectedly. His father sent him to stay with an uncle in another city, far from his former lifestyle. No luxury, no status, no familiar faces, just responsibility. His uncle owned a small construction company. Chris was made to wake up at 5 a.m., report to sites, carry materials, manage workers, and learn accounts. There were no special treatments. Workers didn't care who his father was. He struggled at first. The sun was harsh. The work was exhausting. His hands developed blisters. His ego suffered daily. But slowly, something began to change. He started observing. He learned how buildings were designed. He learned negotiation. He learned leadership not by shouting but by earning trust. For the first time in his life, he felt useful. One afternoon, after successfully managing a difficult contract negotiation on behalf of his uncle, the older man placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You are not a failure, Chris. You are just lost." Those words became fuel. Chris enrolled in evening business courses. He studied construction management and entrepreneurship. What started as punishment turned into passion. Within a few years, he launched his own contracting firm, using the discipline he once rejected. His father, who had once given up on him, watched from a distance as his son rebuilt himself, not with noise, but with consistency. The rebellious boy had not disappeared. He had matured. The confidence he now carried was different. It was no longer arrogance. It was earned. And though he rarely admitted it, during the loneliest nights of rebuilding his life, he sometimes thought of Jennet, the girl who believed in him before he even knew who he was. He often wondered, would she recognize the man he had become? As Jennet settled into her life at university, Femi entered her world like a breath of fresh air. He was a brilliant medical student, driven and ambitious, but there was also a gentleness about him that immediately put her at ease. He was everything she had longed for, a man who not only admired her intellect but also cared for her heart. His kindness, his attentiveness, his quiet way of making her feel seen, it was all too easy to fall in love with him. And before she knew it, their relationship blossomed. By the time they graduated, Femi proposed to her in a moment that felt like something out of a fairy tale, sweeping her off her feet. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed perfect. She could see their future together, a future built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But then the impossible truth shattered her hopes. Femi wasn't from Jennet's tribe. Her parents, especially her father, held tightly to the belief that a marriage outside their tribe was an unforgivable transgression. To them, the preservation of cultural purity was more important than the sanctity of love. Despite Jennet's deep feelings for Femi, despite the quiet assurances he had given her that love would transcend all, her parents' disapproval was a wall she couldn't climb. It was too high, too unyielding. Jennet had rehearsed the conversation in her mind countless times. She believed that if she explained, if she spoke of Femi's character, of his kindness and intelligence, of his devotion to her, maybe, just maybe, her father would see reason. She could appeal to his sense of fairness, to his rationality. But when it came down to it, tradition spoke louder than anything her heart had to offer. Her father's words were like a crushing weight on her chest. "Our daughter will not marry outside this tribe." The finality in his voice was unmistakable, and Jennet felt her world fracture under the pressure. She wanted to fight. She wanted to tell him that love didn't care about borders or bloodlines. She wanted to scream that Femi was everything her father would want for her, respectful, hardworking, and filled with potential. But she was raised to value respect for tradition above all else. To challenge her father would be to disrespect everything she had been taught. It was a line she couldn't cross. That night, Jennet found herself sitting in the quiet of her room, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Her phone lay in her lap, the screen illuminating Femi's name, and for a long moment, she just stared at it. How do you tell someone you love that they are not enough? Not because of their character or heart, but because of their origins? When she finally called him, her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "It's not you. It's my family." The words felt hollow, like a confession of failure. She could feel the weight of his silence on the other end of the line. He was trying to understand, trying to be patient with her, but Jennet knew he was hurting. She had just torn apart something beautiful, something they had both dreamed of. And yet, the cruelty of it was not in the rejection itself, but in the reason behind it. It wasn't that Femi wasn't worthy of her love. It was that the world she lived in wouldn't let them be together. After the call ended, Jennet didn't cry right away. She couldn't. She just sat there, numb, the tears that had threatened to fall still locked inside. The silence of the room was deafening, the air thick with the questions she couldn't answer. When had love become something that needed permission? When had it been reduced to a transaction of cultural approval? She had tried so hard to believe in the fairness of her situation, to believe that love was the one thing that transcended all barriers. But now she was left in a vacuum of doubt, staring at the remnants of her heartache and wondering if she would ever be able to forgive herself. NYSC was supposed to be a pause, one quiet year to breathe, to rebuild after everything Jennet had lost. She arrived at her place of primary assignment with no expectations, no dreams of romance, and no room in her heart for surprises. Love, she had told herself, was something she had already buried. Or so she thought. That afternoon, the sun hung low and harsh in the sky as Jennet walked through a crowded street, her mind lost in routine thoughts, lesson notes, food prices, the weight of adulthood pressing down on her. Cars honked impatiently. Voices overlapped. Life moved fast. Then time slowed. Across the road, through the blur of moving bodies, she saw him. At first, it felt like a trick of memory. The broad shoulders, the familiar stride, the way he tilted his head slightly as he laughed. Her heart skipped, then pounded violently against her chest. No, she whispered under her breath. It can't be. But it was. Chris. Not the carefree boy from the schoolyard. Not the reckless teenager who had disappeared from her life. This was a man, confident, composed, dressed in quiet success. Yet when their eyes met, the years between them collapsed in an instant. The noise around her faded. The street disappeared. All Jennet could see was the boy who used to steal her pencils and the man standing before her now. Chris froze, too. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then his face changed, surprise melting into disbelief, then into something softer. Familiar. Safe. Jennet, he called, his voice uncertain, as if afraid she might vanish if he spoke too loudly. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. They crossed the road toward each other, drawn by something neither time nor distance had been able to erase. When they stood face to face, awkward smiles replaced words. So much to say. So much left unsaid. I thought I'd never see you again, Chris finally said. So did I, she replied, her voice barely steady. In that moment, Jennet realized something terrifying. She had never truly let him go. Life had carried her forward, but her heart had remembered. As they talked, laughter slipped through the cracks of the years they had lost. Stories were exchanged. Silences were comfortable. Fate hadn't just reunited them, it had waited until they were ready. And as Jennet walked away later that evening, her heart heavy yet alive, she understood one undeniable truth. Some connections are not accidents. Some love stories don't begin, they resume. The first meeting had been accidental. The second was intentional. After that afternoon on the street, neither of them pretended it was coincidence anymore. Chris invited Jennet for coffee. A simple invitation. Harmless. Or so they both told themselves. But when she walked into the cafe and saw him already seated, sleeves rolled slightly, confidence resting on him like a well-tailored suit, her breath caught. This wasn't the reckless boy she once knew. This was a man who had fought his battles and won. You've changed, she said softly. Chris smiled. Not the mischievous grin of their childhood, but something steadier, deeper. So have you. Their conversations stretched longer than they intended. What started as catching up turned into hours of unfiltered truth. Chris told her about the night he hit rock bottom, the disappointment in his father's eyes, the loneliness, the moment he decided he would no longer be the boy who wasted potential. Jennet listened, not as a lawyer, not as a NYSC Corps member, but as the girl who once believed in him before the world gave up. And then came the silence. Not an awkward one, a charged one, the kind where words are unnecessary. I used to look for you, Chris confessed one evening as they walked along a quiet road, the streetlights casting soft shadows around them. After we lost contact, I searched. Jennet stopped walking. Why didn't you call? She asked. I wasn't proud of who I was becoming, he replied. You deserved better. Something in her chest tightened. All those years she thought he forgot. All those nights, she wondered if she had imagined what they once shared. The air between them shifted. What they had as children was pure, innocent, safe. What stood between them now was something else entirely. Mature, magnetic, dangerous. Days turned into evenings. Evenings turned into routines. They found comfort in each other again. But this time, their hands lingered when they touched. Their eyes held contact longer than necessary. Their laughter softened into something intimate. One night, rain began to fall suddenly while they were outside. They ran for shelter beneath a small kiosk, both slightly breathless. Jennet looked up at him. The rain poured heavily around them, isolating them from the world. I missed you, she whispered. Chris stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. I never stopped thinking about you. The confession hung between them. For a moment, the past and present collided. They were no longer children, and they were no longer just friends. Chris slowly reached for her hand, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. That was the moment everything changed. Not because they crossed a line, but because they both knew they wanted to. And from that night onward, what they shared was no longer a rekindled friendship. It was a flame. The months that followed felt like a quiet miracle. Every conversation between Chris and Jennet carried a weight neither of them spoke about, the weight of years lost and love rediscovered. But Chris had been planning something. Jennet didn't know that for weeks he had been carrying a small velvet box in his car, waiting for the right moment. Not just any moment, the moment. One evening, Chris asked her to take a drive with him. No questions, he said with a playful smile. They drove toward the outskirts of the city, where the noise faded into silence and the sky stretched endlessly above them. The sun was beginning to set, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. It reminded Jennet of their childhood evenings, when everything felt simple. They stopped at a quiet hill overlooking the city lights. Why are we here? Jennet asked softly. Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. Do you remember primary school? He asked. She laughed lightly. Of course. You copied my homework every week. He smiled, but his voice trembled slightly. You were the first person who ever believed I could be better than I was. Jennet's expression softened. I lost my way, he continued. And when I lost you, I didn't just lose a friend. I lost the best part of myself. Her heart began to race. Chris reached into his pocket. For a second, Jennet thought he was joking. But when he stepped back and slowly lowered himself onto one knee, the world around her seemed to go silent. The wind stilled. The city lights flickered below them. Jennet, he said, his voice no longer playful, but steady and full of emotion. I loved you when we didn't even understand what love was. I loved you when I was too foolish to admit it. And I love you now, not as a boy chasing dreams, but as a man ready to build a life. Tears filled Jennet's eyes. I don't want another lifetime without you. I don't want memories. I want a future. Will you marry me? The small ring caught the last ray of sunlight, glimmering between them. Jennet covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. All the years of separation, heartbreak, and unanswered questions collapsed into that single moment. Yes, she whispered. Chris stood, sliding the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. And when he pulled her into his arms, it wasn't just an embrace, it was a promise fulfilled. Above them, the sun disappeared, but something brighter had just begun. The church was filled long before the ceremony began. Soft music floated through the air, blending with the whispers of family members and the excited chatter of friends who had watched their story unfold from childhood. Jennet stood in the bridal room, staring at herself in the mirror. The white gown shimmered under the lights, but her thoughts were far from the fabric and lace. She wasn't just wearing a dress, She was stepping into destiny. For a brief second, memories flooded her mind. The little girl in primary school. The laughter during lunch breaks. The painful years of silence. The heartbreak with Femi. The unexpected reunion during NYSC. Life had taken her in circles, only to bring her back to where her heart had always belonged. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. "It's time," her bridesmaid whispered. As the doors of the church opened, every head turned. Chris stood at the altar, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, but beneath the calm exterior, his heart pounded wildly. He had faced failure. He had faced rejection. He had once been the boy everyone gave up on. But today he stood as a man redeemed. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, years of separation disappeared. Jennet walked slowly down the aisle, each step heavy with meaning. This was not just a wedding. It was proof that love could survive distance, mistakes, pride, and time. When she reached him, Chris gently took her hand. His fingers trembled slightly. The pastor began the vows, but the world around them seemed to fade. Chris, take you, Jennet," his voice cracked. He wasn't just making a promise. He was honoring the little girl who once believed in him before anyone else did. When it was Jennet's turn, her eyes filled with tears. "I choose you," she whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Not because life brought us back together, but because you were always the one." The congregation erupted in applause when they were pronounced husband and wife. But the most powerful moment came when Chris leaned close and softly said, "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." Jennet smiled through her tears. "Some loves," she replied quietly, "are written before we understand them." As they walked out of the church hand in hand, cheers echoing behind them, neither of them knew that life still had one more test waiting. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had chosen each other. And that was enough. Months into her marriage, Jennet had finally settled into the rhythm of her new life. Saturday afternoons were simple: groceries, soft music playing in the car, and Chris waiting at home. It was peaceful, stable, safe. That afternoon, the supermarket was crowded. The hum of conversations blended with the clatter of shopping carts. Jennet stood in the cereal aisle, comparing brands absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting. Then she felt it, a presence. Before she could turn, warm arms wrapped gently around her waist. Her body froze. "Jennet," the voice was low, familiar, dangerous. Her heart slammed violently against her chest as she slowly turned around. Femi. Time did not just slow, it stopped. He looked older, more refined, dressed in a crisp shirt that spoke of success. But his eyes were the same. The same ones that had once promised her forever. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them faded into background noise. "You look happy," Femi said softly, searching her face as though trying to read what years had hidden. Jennet swallowed. "I am." But her voice betrayed her. He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "I heard you got married." "Yes," she replied, clutching her shopping cart as if it could anchor her. A pause. "I think about you sometimes," he admitted. The words landed like a spark on dry grass. Jennet's breath caught. She shouldn't be standing this close. She shouldn't be remembering the way he once held her hand under the university library table. She shouldn't remember the proposal that never happened. But she did. And memory is a dangerous thing. He told her about his marriage to Tolu. "It's complicated," he said with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Complicated. That single word stirred something inside her she thought she had buried. She knew she should leave. Say goodbye. Protect her marriage. Instead, when he asked for her number, she hesitated. Just for a second. But a second is all temptation needs. She gave it to him. That night, Jennet lay in bed beside Chris, staring into the darkness. Chris slept peacefully, one arm resting gently across her waist. Safe. Loving. Faithful. Her phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. A message. "Femi. Seeing you today brought back memories I thought I had lost." Her heart raced. She didn't reply immediately. But she didn't delete the message either. And that was the beginning. The restaurant was softly lit, the hum of quiet conversations blending with the clinking of cutlery. Jennet sat across from Femi, her fingers wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She was smiling, but her heart wasn't at ease. Femi leaned forward, his voice low and familiar. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes I still wonder what our life would have been like." Jennet swallowed. She shouldn't have come. She knew that. Yet here she was. Then it happened. Across the restaurant, near the entrance, Chris walked in with 3 colleagues. He was mid-conversation, laughing lightly until his eyes drifted across the room.
And stopped.
There she was, his wife, seated intimately across from another man. Time didn't move. Chris didn't blink. His colleagues kept walking, unaware that something had shifted. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his face remained calm, controlled. Too controlled. At the table, Jennet felt it before she saw him. That strange sensation. The feeling of being watched. She turned. Their eyes met. Her heart dropped. The color drained from her face. The restaurant noise faded into a dull echo. Femi followed her gaze, confusion turning into quiet alarm as he recognized Chris from their wedding photos. Chris held her gaze for 3 long seconds. 3 seconds that felt like judgment, like heartbreak, like silent screaming. Then he adjusted his suit, smoothed his expression, and walked toward them. Jennet's hands began to tremble beneath the table. Femi straightened in his seat. Chris arrived at their table with a polite smile. "Good evening," he said evenly. His voice was steady. Too steady. Jennet forced herself to breathe. "Chris," Femi stood up halfway, unsure whether to extend a hand or sit back down. "I see you've met," Chris said calmly, his eyes briefly scanning Femi before returning to Jennet. Not accusing. Not angry. Just unreadable. "We were just," Jennet started, but the words dissolved in her throat. Chris nodded slightly. "I won't interrupt," he said. "Enjoy your evening." And just like that, he turned and walked back to his colleagues. No shouting. No scene. No questions. That was what frightened her the most. Back at his table, Chris picked up the menu as if nothing had happened. But he wasn't reading it. His mind replayed the image over and over. Her smile, her posture, the familiarity between them. At the other table, the air had shifted completely. Femi exhaled slowly. He handled that well. Jennet didn't respond. Because she knew Chris. And that wasn't handling it. That was holding something in. She stood abruptly. "I need to go." Outside, the night air felt heavier than before. Her heart pounded, not from being caught, but from the unknown. Why hadn't he reacted? Why hadn't he asked? Was he pretending not to care? Or did he already know everything? And somewhere inside her, a terrifying thought whispered, silence is sometimes louder than anger. Jennet's birthday dinner ended in silence. The cake had been cut, the candles blown out, the smiles exchanged. But beneath the surface, something fragile trembled between them. That night, after the guests had left and the house grew quiet, Chris stood by the window, his back turned to her. The city lights flickered outside, but inside the room, the air felt suffocating. "Jennet," he finally said, his voice calm. Too calm. Her heart pounded. She had been waiting for this moment. Yes. He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his eyes were not angry. They were wounded. "Who is he to you?" The question was simple, but it carried weeks of silence, suspicion, and restraint. Jennet swallowed. Her fingers trembled as she sat down. "He's someone from my past." Chris gave a faint nod. "I know that. I saw the way you looked at him." That broke her. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Chris, I swear to you, nothing happened." He walked closer now, not aggressively, but heavily, like a man carrying something too large for his chest. "Did you ever regret marrying me?" he asked quietly. The words hit harder than a shout would have. Jennet shook her head quickly, tears falling freely now. "No. Never. I love you." "But you met him," Chris continued, his voice cracking slightly. "You gave him your number." You went to dinner with him. Jennet, you let him back in. Silence. She couldn't deny it. I was confused, she whispered. When I saw him again, it felt like unfinished business. Like a chapter one never closed. But I never crossed the line. I never touched him. I never betrayed you physically. Chris laughed softly, not with humor, but with pain. Sometimes emotional betrayal cuts deeper than physical, he said. The room felt smaller. I chose not to embarrass you at that restaurant, Chris continued. Do you know why? Jennet looked up slowly. Because I trust you. And I didn't want to react from anger. I wanted to believe my wife would choose me. That word, choose, settled heavily between them. Jennet slid off the couch and knelt before him, her pride dissolving completely. I choose you, she sobbed. I chose you then. I choose you now. I was wrong to let it go that far emotionally. I should have told you. I should have protected our marriage. Chris closed his eyes. A tear escaped despite his effort to remain composed. For weeks, he admitted, I kept asking myself if I was second choice. If I only got you because your parents rejected him. Jennet's face crumpled. No. Chris, you were never second. You were my first home. My first friend. My first love. I was just too blind to see it clearly back then. The silence that followed was not cold anymore. It was fragile. Chris bent down and lifted her to her feet. For a moment, they simply stood there, forehead against forehead, both broken in different ways. I am hurt, he said honestly. But I don't want to lose you over something we can fight through. Jennet nodded through tears. I'll cut contact. Completely. No more calls. No more messages. I'll protect what we have. Chris studied her face, searching for truth, for reassurance, for the girl he once knew in primary school. Finally, he pulled her into his arms. Not tightly, not triumphantly, but carefully, like something precious that had almost slipped away. They cried, not just from pain, but from relief, from fear, from love. Forgiveness was not instant. Trust would take time. But that night, they chose each other again. And sometimes love isn't about never falling. It's about deciding who you stand back up with. The house felt different after that night. Not broken, but fragile. The silence between Jennet and Chris was no longer filled with suspicion, but with reflection. Forgiveness had been spoken. But forgiveness, they both realized, was not a switch you turn on. It was a process. A rebuilding. Jennet watched Chris differently now. She noticed the quiet strength in him. The way he still made her tea in the morning. The way he adjusted the curtains so sunlight wouldn't hit her face while she slept. He hadn't withdrawn. He hadn't punished her with coldness. That hurt more than anger would have. One evening, unable to carry the weight any longer, Jennet broke down. I never stopped choosing you, she said through tears. Even when I was confused, even when memories came back, I never stopped choosing you. Chris stood still for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice calm but heavy. I saw you that night in the restaurant, and I felt something I never want to feel again. Not anger. Not jealousy. Fear. He paused. Fear that I might lose you without even knowing when it started. Jennet's heart shattered at his honesty. Chris stepped closer. I didn't fight you that night because I didn't want a wife who stays because she's forced. I wanted a wife who stays because she chooses me. Silence filled the space between them, but this time, it was sacred. Jennet fell into his arms, not out of guilt, but out of clarity. The past had tested her. Nostalgia had tempted her. But love, real love, had remained steady in the man standing before her. And for the first time, she understood something deeply. Femi had been a chapter. Chris was her story. In the weeks that followed, they didn't pretend nothing happened. They talked. They prayed. They laughed again, slowly at first, then freely. Trust wasn't instantly restored. It was rebuilt brick by brick. And one quiet Sunday morning, as they sat side by side in church, their fingers intertwined, Jennet realized something powerful. Love is not about never being shaken. It is about choosing each other after the shaking stops. Chris squeezed her hand gently, as if reading her thoughts. They had survived what could have destroyed them. And now they were not just husband and wife. They were partners, friends, forgivers, and this time fully certain. Together, they stepped into their new beginning, not as two people bound by destiny, but as two people who chose each other. Again, the end.